Werner Brandt was executed by his own army at 0447 on the morning of August the 7th, 1943. He was 32 years old, a Feldwebel on the Eastern Front. The court-martial that ended his life took less than 6 hours. The charge was treason, but the 40 Soviet prisoners who walked out of a dark field east of Belgorod the night before knew something the court-martial never recorded. What Werner did in that field, and why a German sergeant chose it knowing exactly what it would cost him, is the story you are about to hear. This is not a story about a hero. Werner Brandt did not think of himself as one. He was not decorated. He was not famous. He was not the kind of man history typically preserves in its official records. He was a schoolteacher from Munich who spent 3 years on the Eastern Front watching what happens when the structure around a person gradually convinces them that following orders and doing right are the same thing. They are not the same thing. Werner found the difference between them in a burned wheat field on the night of August the 6th, 1943, and his own army shot him for it before the sun came up. Werner taught literature at a secondary school in the Schwabing district of Munich before the war. He was 25 when he took the position. He believed in precise language. He believed that the right words, placed with care, could reach the part of a person that nothing else could touch. He taught his students to read closely, to question what a text was actually saying beneath what it appeared to be saying, and to understand that the space between those two things is where the truth usually lives. The Wehrmacht called him up in September of 1939. He spent 2 years in France and Poland, learning to follow orders with the efficiency of someone who has decided that asking too many questions is a luxury unavailable to men in his position. This is not a personal failing. It is what armies are designed to produce in the people who serve them. Werner was not exceptional in this. He was typical. He arrived on the Eastern Front in the autumn of 1941. The war in the East was unlike anything on any other front. It operated on its own logic. Directives issued by German High Command in the summer of 1941 established that Soviet political officers captured in battle were to be shot immediately. No detention, no transport, no process. The order was written, distributed, and carried out in enough units that it became, over time, simply part of how things worked. The practice extended further in the field. Prisoner transport during retreats was frequently described in reports as impractical. Impractical, a clean word for what it meant in practice. Werner had heard of executions carried out under this logic. Most men who served on the Eastern Front had. But there is a distance between hearing about something and standing in front of it that cannot be measured in ordinary units. He was about to cross that distance. By the summer of 1943, the German position on the Eastern Front was deteriorating in ways that official communiques did not fully reflect. Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk, had been designed to cut off and destroy the Soviet salient and restore the initiative Germany had lost at Stalingrad 6 months earlier. The Wehrmacht committed close to 3,000 armored vehicles and nearly 1 million soldiers. It was the largest single offensive Germany would mount on the Eastern Front. It failed. The Soviets had received intelligence about the operation months in advance. They constructed defensive positions of extraordinary depth, layered with minefields, anti-tank guns, and infantry prepared to absorb enormous casualties. When the German armor drove forward on July the 5th, it drove into a trap that had been prepared with a precision the Germans had not encountered before. German losses mounted rapidly. The offensive stalled. On July the 17th, German forces began to pull back. By August the 5th, Soviet troops had retaken Belgorod. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat eastward across the scorched farmland south of Kursk. What military documents called a tactical withdrawal, the men carrying it out experienced as something considerably less organized. Werner's company was among the formations moving through the flat, burned countryside east of Belgorod in the early hours of August the 6th. The roads had been churned to deep mud by armor and summer rain. The column moved in near total darkness, because moving in daylight had become increasingly dangerous as Soviet air superiority over the Eastern Front grew through the summer. At approximately 2 in the morning, A forward patrol encountered 40 Soviet soldiers near a dry irrigation ditch beside a burned wheat field, 2 kilometers east of the village of Prokhorovka. They were not advancing. They were not armed. They were wounded, dehydrated, and moving in the wrong direction, which indicated they had been separated from their unit during the Soviet counteroffensive and had been wandering without supply or direction for several days. Several could not walk without leaning on the men next to them. The field, dressing on one man's head, had gone dark and stiff. The youngest among them could not have been more than 16 or 17 years old. His boots had long since worn through at the soles. They had nothing. The patrol bound their wrists with wire and brought them to the edge of the wheat field and waited. Oberleutnant Rolf Steiner, commanding Werner's company, arrived and assessed the situation in approximately 90 seconds. Then he walked to where Werner was standing and placed a folded piece of paper in his hand. 3 sentences. Werner was given authority over the prisoners. He was instructed to execute them before dawn. The reason given was operational. The column could not afford the delay. The order was consistent with standing Eastern Front directives regarding prisoners during withdrawal. Steiner did not wait for a response. He walked back toward the column. Werner stood at the edge of the field with the paper in his hand. 40 men knelt in the dirt in front of him, wrists bound with wire, looking at the ground or at the dark sky or at nothing particular, not praying. Waiting in the way people wait, when they understand that whatever happens next belongs entirely to someone else. 6 men from Werner's squad stood behind him. They had all heard the order. The column was moving. Dawn was roughly 90 minutes away. This is where the trap closed. Not violently, not suddenly. The way doors close in abandoned buildings, quietly, with a finality the body registers before the mind has caught up. Werner had the order in writing. He had the authority. He had 6 armed men behind him and standing operational directives above him. Everything in the structure around him pointed in one direction, and that direction was entirely clear. Private Klaus Mauer, 19 years old, from Hanover, 11 months on the Eastern Front, took a step forward. "Feldwebel," he said, quietly. "The order." Werner looked at the paper. Then he looked at the 40 men in front of him. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Think about that for a moment. Not what you would have done. Because you were not there, and the Eastern Front was not a thought experiment. It was cold and dark, and it had spent 2 years teaching everyone in that field exactly one lesson. The lesson was that the order is the boundary of what you are responsible for. Everything inside the order is procedure. Everything outside it is a problem that belongs to you alone. Werner stood at that boundary, and then he stepped across it. If you can feel the weight of what Werner is about to choose and what it is going to cost him, subscribe now. Because what happens in this field is why his name never appeared in any account of this war. "Cut them loose," Werner said. No one moved. "Cut them loose, all of them." He walked to the nearest prisoner and cut the wire at his wrists with his field knife. Then the next man. Then the next. 40 sets of bound wrists cut one at a time in the dark field, while 6 German soldiers stood behind him and said nothing. When he finished, he stood and looked at the 40 men. Some were looking at him, some were looking at the wire on the ground. Several appeared not to understand what had happened. Werner pointed east, toward Soviet lines, the direction they had come from. One word. In German. They did not speak German. They understood the gesture and the direction and the fact that they were no longer bound. That was enough. They began to move, slowly at first. The ones who could not walk without help were supported by the ones who could. Within 3 minutes, the field was empty. Werner turned around. Mauer was watching him with an expression that had no simple name. "He will know," Werner said. He meant Steiner. "You do not need to say anything. It will be apparent when the prisoners are not accounted for. But if you feel you must report it, then report it." He said this without pressure and without anger. a simple statement to men who had been placed under his responsibility. Maurer looked at the other 5 men. Then he walked to the wire lying on the ground, picked it up, and dropped it into the irrigation ditch. It was a small gesture. It meant nothing in practical terms. The report came anyway. 45 minutes later, Steiner was standing in front of Werner in the dark. He did not raise his voice. The Eastern Front had stripped that kind of display from him the same way it had stripped most decorative things from most people. "You understand what you have done," Steiner said. "Yes," Werner said. "You understand that I cannot leave this unreported." "Yes," Werner said. "Is there anything you want to say in your defense?" Werner considered this the way a man considers a question he has already answered for himself. "No," he said. He was placed under guard before the column resumed its march. The court-martial convened at 11 in the morning on August the 6th, 1943, in a damaged farmhouse 12 kilometers east of the field where the wire had been cut. 3 officers presided. The charges were read. The evidence was presented. Werner confirmed that the account of events was accurate, that he had acted without coercion, that he had fully understood the order he had been given and had chosen not to follow it. He was asked 3 times whether he had anything to say in mitigation or in his defense. 3 times he said no. The verdict was delivered at 5:47 in the afternoon. Treason, aiding the enemy, conduct contrary to military discipline in time of war. Sentence: death by firing squad, to be carried out before sunrise on August the 7th, 1943. Werner spent the last night of his life in a grain storage room at the back of the farmhouse. A lantern, a wooden chair, a table, paper and a pen had been placed on the table in case he wanted to write anything before morning. He sat at the table for a long time without touching them. There was no one he was certain would receive what he wrote, and there was nothing that needed to be explained. He had not freed those men because he had worked out a careful argument for why freeing them was correct. He had not arrived at his choice through a sequence of logical steps. He had stood in that field and understood, in a part of himself that 3 years on the Eastern Front had not fully reached, that carrying out that order would change him into something he was not willing to become. He had not known, at the moment of understanding, that he had approximately 11 hours left. Knowing would not have changed it. This is the piece of Werner's story that takes the longest to hold. He was not exchanging his life for 40. He was not calculating a trade. He was simply refusing. And when a man refuses something on the Eastern Front in 1943, the consequences arrive before sunrise, with their own logic, their own paperwork, and their own schedule. He sat at the table in the grain room. He did not write. He did not sleep. At 04:30 on the morning of August the 7th, 2 guards opened the door and told him it was time. Werner stood. He straightened the jacket of his uniform. He walked out. The firing squad was assembled in the farmyard. 6 men. 6 rifles. Dawn was still 30 minutes away. The sky was that particular dark blue that exists in the final minutes before light, when everything has form, but nothing has color yet. Werner did not speak. He walked to the stone wall at the far end of the farmyard and stood against it. He had declined the blindfold when it was offered. He stood straight and looked at the 6 men in front of him with the stillness of a person who has nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose, and understands both of those things completely. The command was given at 04:47. Feldwebel Werner Brandt, 32 years old. The war on the Eastern Front would continue for another 21 months after his death. The official record listed his name, rank, charge, and date of execution. His name was entered into the regimental log with a brief notation regarding the offense. There was no ceremony, and no marker placed at the farmhouse. The letter that eventually reached his mother in Munich said only that her son had died in the course of his duties on the Eastern Front. She was not informed of the field, the wire, or the 40 men. She was given nothing that would have helped her understand what kind of man her son had been in the final hours of his life. She received the notification of a death without the story of a choice. The 40 Soviet soldiers who walked east into the dark were never identified in records that have been cross-referenced with the court-martial proceedings. Whether they made it through Soviet lines that night is not documented. Whether any of them survived the war cannot be confirmed. Whether any of them understood, in the moments after their wrists were cut free and a German sergeant pointed them east, exactly what they had been given and what it would cost the man standing behind them in that field is also not known. What is known is that they walked into the dark, away from a field where they were supposed to die before sunrise. The Eastern Front produced its own vast and largely unrecorded internal history. Men who carried out orders that should not have been given. Men who, in isolated instances that rarely appeared in official accounts, refused. Those refusals were almost never preserved, for the obvious reason that the institution which required the refusal was also the institution keeping the record. Werner Brandt's refusal was preserved only because the court-martial had to document it to justify the sentence. He did not refuse because he expected to be remembered. He refused because in that field, in that dark, with the paper in his hand and 40 men kneeling in the dirt in front of him, he found something in himself that the war had not yet taken. Something that knew the difference between what a person is ordered to be and what a person actually is. The distance between those two things cost him everything. Before sunrise, August the 7th, 1943, and 40 men walked east into the dark, into uncertainty, into a war that was still far from over. Werner never found out whether they made it. Neither did we. What Werner found in that field, and chose to act on, was not rare because it required extraordinary courage. It was rare because the conditions around him had been specifically designed to make it feel unavailable. The question that his story leaves behind is not whether he was right. The question is what it costs a person to remain who they are when everything around them is organized to make them into someone else. Werner answered that question one way. Before sunrise, in a farmyard east of Belgorod, 32 years old. If this story left something in you that you cannot quite name, put it in the comments. Tell us what you think Werner understood in that field that the order could not reach. Your answer matters more than you think. And if you want more stories like this, stories about the men and women history preserved only by accident, stories about the real weight of impossible choices, subscribe now. There are more fields, more nights, more moments where one person looked at what the world was demanding of them and quietly refused. Those stories deserve to be heard.